Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our event very shortly. Good morning and welcome to this event discussing the UK's standards watchdogs. I'm Hannah White, I'm Deputy Director of the IFG, and this is the second session in our special conference which we're running today on standards in public life. We've already heard from Lord Evans, Chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, about the need to change how the UK upholds standards. His committee's report was out earlier this week, and that emphasised a call for more independence for various regulators and watchdogs, and that's one of the things we'll be discussing in this session. Yesterday's events in Parliament have again highlighted the serious issues facing our system for regulating standards in public life. The Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has accepted this morning that it was unhelpful of the government to conflate an individual standards case, that's the finding that the former Conservative Minister Owen Paterson had engaged in paid advocacy, with Conservative MPs' views that the need for reform of the common standards system. And we're awaiting further details of what the government thinks should happen now, but it does seem to be clear that they intend to press on with reform. What's not yet clear is whether opposition parties, and indeed the existing standards regulation system in the Commons, agree with the government's critique of the current system. Unfortunately, as Lord Evans made clear this morning, yesterday's events are not an isolated example of the challenges currently facing the regulation of standards in the UK. In just the last year, we've seen the Green Seal affair, we've seen the appointment of Gina Collett-Angelo as an NED at the Department of Health and Social Care, we've seen controversy over the funding of the Prime Minister's flat refurbishment. All of these things have placed a spotlight on the rules meant to govern how ministers, civil servants and special advisors can operate. I'm really delighted to say that we've got a fantastic panel here today to discuss these issues, all of whom are involved in standards regulation and watchdogs in the UK. I'm joined here at the IFG's headquarters in London by Chris Bryant, who is Chair of the Common Standards Committee, and he is MP for Rhondda. I'm joined from Norfolk by Dame Shirley Pearce, who's a member of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, CSPL, and former Chair of the College of Policing. And I'm joined by Lord Pickles. Lord Pickles, I'm not quite sure where you're joining us from.
Essex, glorious Essex.
Essex. and he is chair of ACOBA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, and of course, a former Conservative MP between 1992 and 2017. Before we start, just a few brief housekeeping notes. We'll be live tweeting the event from IFG events using hashtag IFG standards. Please send in your questions at any time during the event, and we'll have a video and sound recording of the event up on our website in the next 24 hours. Chris, can I start with you?
No.
I mentioned the government's U-turn this morning after yesterday's what I would term appalling events in the Commons. In your view, started for 10, what should happen now?
We should have a straightforward vote on the Owen Paterson case on Monday. Now, I'm told that that is maybe what Jacob Rees-Mogg was saying. I'm not sure. I was a bit perplexed by what Jacob Rees-Mogg said this morning because, I mean, it was diametrically opposite to what he said yesterday, and it seemed like he didn't understand the motion that he voted for yesterday, which is a bit of a shame in a leader of the House. But leaving that aside, there are two things that need to happen. Undoubtedly, the system could improve. There are elements of the code which I think are badly written at the moment, and we on the Standards Committee have been engaged in that work for the last 9 months. We've been doing an inquiry. Lots of people have given evidence, including the Leader of the House. He didn't say any of what he said yesterday in the House when he came before the committee, but anyway, he sort of slightly suggested it. I think there may be, and we're also very close to producing a report on changes to the operation of the code with some suggestions and some outlining of the pros and cons of the various options that there might be. I'm happy to come on to those later if people want. But just one thing I'd say very strongly, we gave Owen Paterson a very fair hearing. We went, as our legal advisor told us, we bent over backwards to make sure he had a fair hearing. I've spoken to one retired High Court judge and asked whether he thinks that we did due process and natural justice, and he thinks, yeah, absolutely.
So you're saying need for a vote to resolve the individual case. Separately, you think there is potentially a case for looking at some reforms. What do you say to the critique about the what was said a lot yesterday was that there is no opportunity for MPs to appeal within the current system?
Well, there is. I mean, people, I think, misunderstand the process. But if I just go back one step, the terrible thing about yesterday was you cannot change the rules at the very last minute for a named individual. That is, by definition, the opposite of justice. That is injustice. It's the polar opposite of the rule of law. And that's what a lot of Tories are very angry that they voted for now. And that the whip was used was all totally inappropriate. Appeal. So what happens is that the Commissioner does a report, a memorandum it's called. She sends it to the individual for comments, and either in mitigation or in defence. Once she's completed that process, then she sends it to us. And that's when the member appeals to the committee on the facts. And then the committee decides on the sanction. Now, I've long been in favour of the idea of some form of appeal for the sanction. The difficulty about that is, the way the IEP, the Independent Expert Panel, does this is that they have 9 members, 3 of them recuse themselves on the original decision on the facts, and the appeal is then heard by those 3 who've recused themselves. I guess we could do that in our committee. We've talked about it many, many times, and the problem is we are constituted of 7 lay members and 7 MPs who are on party political balance. So how do you construct who the 3 should be? Should the chair not take part in the original decision and always chair the appeal? One of my anxieties is people are talking about having a more like a court system where you can cross-examine witnesses. That requires legal representation. Legal representation cannot, by definition, obviously benefit a wealthy MP as opposed to a poor MP. So you'd have to have legal aid for MPs. And I just note that over the last 10 years, we've cut all legal aid for everybody else. And I think it would look a little bit odd if we were suddenly introducing legal aid for MPs. So those are the problems. And I think, broadly speaking, that's what we may end up laying out in our committee report. There's no need for another committee.
Do you think the government is, I mean, from what Jacob Rees-Mogg was saying this morning, it seemed he thought the committee would continue to happen. I guess he's hoping for cross-party engagement with that now. Do you think that's likely?
I think there are no chances of cross-party engagement because of the way yesterday was conducted. I would guess that the Labour Party feels that every election leaflet has already been printed because, you know, inevitably, I'm afraid all of this feels like return to sleaze. And the worst thing of it all is, I think if Owen Paterson had come to our committee and said, you know what, I see it differently, but in the end, of course, you're the committee that judges on the rules. I accept my punishment and sanction. I appeal to my constituents to judge me on my record on other matters. But the truth for constituents like mine is he received £100,000 a year. He lobbied ministers and officials on behalf of his clients. £100,000 is more than the average price of a house in my constituency. So I think for constituents up and down the land, they will just think, hang on, what on earth were Tory MPs doing yesterday? And to be fair, lots of Conservative MPs have been in touch with me since to say, I'm really, really sorry. We've got ourselves into a terrible, terrible place. I'm afraid the government led them down that route.
And just turning to so the Committee on Standards in Public Life report, which was out earlier this week, put a lot of emphasis on the need for independence and protections for independence of ethical regulators. Where do you think this has left the position of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards? There was a government minister on the radio this morning saying her position was difficult. We've had Conservative MPs implying the same. How can we protect these roles in the way that CSPL says is needed? Well,
independence is vital because it's about the trust of the public in the system. And the 7 independent members of my committee do an admirable job. Some of them are obviously not very happy with what happened in the Commons yesterday, and for all I know, they're talking to the press. I don't know. They're at perfect liberty to do so. The Commissioner, I think, she is expert in this field. She is very robust. She is very fair. She is methodical. I think she does a good job, and I stand 100% behind her. It's completely inappropriate for government ministers to start demanding that she consider her position, and I'm sure she'll still be in place right the way through to the end of her contract. And sorry, just one other thing about independence. I think there is a problem for the ministerial code. I'll just highlight one thing for you. So our code, the Code of Conduct for MPs, says you have to register all gifts and hospitality. But it says that you don't have to if you've received it in your capacity as a minister. So 2 people might go to Wimbledon final, cost of a ticket £3,000 or something. The shadow Secretary of State for Culture has to declare it, but the Secretary of State for Culture doesn't have to declare it, or only declares it on the ministerial code, which is published 9 months to a year later. I just think that that's a nonsense. We need much closer alignment of the registration, and every member of the public should be able to know everything relating to an individual MP and what affects the decisions that they make.
I think that's really interesting, and the RFG has done some work this year on the ministerial code and made some of these observations about the inconsistencies between the 2 systems. Lord Pickles, can I turn to you now? I think you kindly said I could call you Eric. Can I get your reaction to events yesterday in the Commons and indeed today's statements from the government? And the government's clearly focused on reform of the system for regulating standards within the House of Commons. Do you think that opens up an opportunity for wider reforms of the sort that I know that you've spoken to CSPL about?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that the report that we were going to be considered before all this started was predicated on the basis that actually there's quite a good system for MPs and for peers, and it's a rest that needed quite a lot of reform. I think what you approved yesterday is how fragile the whole system is, and it is capable of being completely knocked out of kilter. And in a way, it's symbolic of the whole system, because reforms only come during a crisis. And what the Commons and ministers seem to do is they always overreact. They tend to make it worse. When we're not in a time of crisis, there's generally not an appetite to do something about it. And I think this report is fairly reasonable. On the generality, I was listening to Sir Peter Bottomley talk about the debate, I think it was towards the end of the last Labour government, when this system was brought in. And I think a reasonable point is that there has been a kind of rattling of the system by the ability to be able to recall a member of Parliament. And I've certainly felt for a while there was like a ticking bomb there that sooner or later would kind of problems that we saw yesterday. I'm blindsided about what Mr. Rees-Mogg may or may not have said. My view is they simply need to get on with it. I should declare an interest in that. I know Owen Paterson very well, sat in the cabinet with him, worked with him very closely for Ian Duncan Smith's leadership bid. My impression is that this is a man who thinks he's been wrong, who doesn't feel he's had his say, and I would move on and let him have his 17 witnesses, let that be open and transparent. But the problem becomes this. I mean, of course, he's an honourable man, and I hope that when these 17 witnesses are heard, that he will be exonerated. But it's just a possibility he might not. And at that point, the whole thing becomes much worse in terms of what does the Commons decide to do then. I regret that there's a kind of the politics that are in this, and I think Chris is quite right that people's election addresses will have been written. I mean, the process of what brought down the major government was around sleaze. I was around at the time. It was a dreadful experience. But every slight infringement, there's almost a knee-jerk reaction that people want to return to sleaze. And I think we need to try and take as much heat out of this and to try and come up with a number of improvements. I thought some of the suggestions that Chris made were eminently sensible in terms of getting it back onto a kind of kilter. Oh, my dear friend, of course you can.
Sorry, thanks, Eric. Just one thing about the witnesses. So it's absolutely standard when people provide character witness evidence to a court that's considered by the court in writing. It's very rare for witness statements like that to be heard orally, but they have to be heard. And we read all the statements. There was no need to question them because we weren't questioning what they were saying. We know that that's what they said. I couldn't see the value of bringing Priti Patel in to explain the rules of the House of Commons to us.
I mean, I understand that, Chris. I've read the report, and I understand the point, and I thought you made it very eloquently. But I think we use that well-known political. We are where we are, and I think the only way to try and get back onto some kind of kilter is just to see this thing through. It's obviously a big deal for Owen. I echo him very much. And sometimes that you have to do things in politics to arrive at a resolution to prove beyond reasonable doubt. But I do understand the points you're making. I'm not suggesting in any way that you've done anything wrong.
You mentioned, just to go back, Eric, to the start of your remarks, you talked about the fragility of the current system and yesterday having demonstrated that. What are your thoughts on the proposals in CSPL's report to put more of our current arrangements onto a statutory footing?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting. I'm quite neutral on the idea in terms of what they want to do, but I do know from as an ex-party manager, it's sometimes difficult to get parliamentary time to do it, and I wouldn't like us to be in stasis. I mean, I've moved in my responsibility to push the envelope as far as I can, so far as the business appointments are concerned. And we've made some quite big strides. Hopefully we might come into them in terms of being much more transparent. And I believe there's lots I could do. Truth is, I'm appointed for a 5-year period. It's right that I'm not going to be reappointed for a further 5-year period. I want to see some progress. And I have to say that I very much welcome that the reporters looked at those levels of appointments below ACOBA level, because that's the bulk. And no doubt to be controversial, but I don't have the slightest doubt that there is a scandal there which would make last 24 hours look fairly tame. I noticed last week a select committee expressing concerns about the activities of Facebook in terms of recruiting senior civil servants. I know there are some concerns, but if I was a predatory company, the people, I wouldn't be that interested in senior ministers and senior civil servants. It were the people who actually did the job I'd be very interested in. And at the moment, we have no idea. And there's virtually no control. Some departments do it extraordinarily well. Other departments are, I think I use the word slipshod, verging on negligence. There's 34,000 civil servants leave the civil servants every year. And we're only looking at the best part of a couple of hundred. Now, clearly 34,000 would need to be looked at. But even if it was, say, 1,000 or even 500, that's probably 3 or 4 times greater than the number that we're currently looking at. So I would urge the government, if they've got money to spare, to put some money into terms of training, bringing up to standards and doing some monitoring, because if they don't, then they will have the whirlwind of a considerable scandal.
And I think that's a really interesting point you make there about the resourcing of our ethical standards system, because certainly as ACOBA is currently configured, you wouldn't have the resources to carry out the sort of work you've talked about there.
Well, I mean, ACOBA runs on roughly £300,000 a year in terms of officer time and full-time employment staff. So, I mean, we have 4 members of staff to do that. I mean, we have tentatively, we have started a reporting mechanism from the beginning of this year that we do write to people where we feel there's been a breach, and we do publish everything online. And in our annual report, we will be naming those people who have breached the rules. But if you are to move us on to where we would have an investigatory powers, we're clearly going to need an awful lot more people. And if I was looking to spend money, I think I'd be looking to want to spend money on that training and that monitoring. And I reckon you could probably be able to produce something fairly decent right across government for maybe not much more than £500,000, which in the long term, in terms of protecting the government's interest, was something that would be very worthwhile.
Sounds like a bargain to me. Dame Shirley, can I come to you now? Obviously, you have a great deal of experience, both in higher education, also in the College of Policing, and I'm interested in your reflections, on the last 24 hours, but also the sort of more recent period we've seen in terms of standards in public life. What do you think that our system of government has to learn from other sectors?
Yes, I mean, all sectors are different. They all have their own challenges, but all of the public sector settings in which I've operated and worked have the 7 Nolan principles as at the core. And the purpose of that is to ensure that public interest, whatever group of the public it is always placed ahead of any personal interest. And each sector has developed its own regulatory framework that meets the needs of that sector. So, for example, in health, each individual health professional has its own individual relationship with an external body, an accrediting body. So, for example, medics have a license to practice from the GMC. And if you breach that set of professional standards, you lose your license to practice. In politics, in terms of what do we transfer and what do we learn, in politics, MPs are elected through a democratic process, and you can't just transfer one system which works well in one sector to this. And the regulatory system must respect that democratic process. But I think what we learn from other sectors is that public trust is strengthened by knowing that there is strong regulation of individuals. And we also know that there is relatively high concern about trust in MPs amongst the public. So the thrust of our recommendations, which I think have been fairly well accepted by people today, is that we need to strengthen this regulatory system. And there are things that are not strong about the regulatory system at the moment, and this last 24 hours has demonstrated that rather well. So we're arguing for greater independence of the regulators, and some being put on a statutory footing that aren't at the moment, and we see the benefits of that. Stronger and clearer rules, and a move from a culture of convention, which seems not always to be robust, maybe unfortunately, but a move from convention to a culture of greater compliance.
Thanks very much. And Chris, I think you wanted to come in.
Just on convention,
said there.
I used to be a priest in the Church of England, and one of the hilarious things was every year there'd be a terrible row in the congregation about what we did on Good Friday, and the vicar was nearly always the only person who could really remember. And he said, no, this is what we've always done. Honestly, yes, we've always used incense. No, honestly, you're completely wrong, definitely. And so the vicar always got to decide. And it's a bit like that, I think, sometimes with conventions, that nobody can quite remember what the convention was. And not least at the moment in Parliament, one of the strange, I often refer to Parliament as a community, one of the strange things is we've got very little corporate memory. We've had an enormous turnover of MPs since 2015. Lots of them were there for some people were there for 2 years, and then another election, and then another election, and then we've had COVID. So there's very little memory of what these conventions are anymore. And that's problematic, because it means government always goes, no, honestly, we always had incense on Good Friday. And
I think one of the interesting things, though, is if you argue that you need to write down the rules, how do you ensure that you've got cross-party buy-in to the changing of those rules? Oh, I think there might be a problem with your microphone. We'll just sort that out.
Are you talking to me?
Sorry, I was putting that to Chris, but sorry, Dame Shelly, did you want to come in?
Well, I mean, I would only say that you've got to ensure that you have got cross-party involvement in the process of setting and determining the rules.
Yes,
you've got to have a process of developing a system that has buy-in.
Yes, because obviously otherwise the government at any point, because by definition it has a majority in the House of Commons, it can just rewrite the rules every single time. So you want to have a set of systems, and that has been the British way of doing things, that stands the test of time. And incidentally, just on the present system, it was only actually introduced by Andrea Leadsom on the 7th of January 2019, having 7 lay members who had votes on the committee. So, and there is a problem. If you keep on changing the system all the time, that is actually unfair to people as well, because one individual might go, well, hang on, if this system had operated when I was done 6 months ago, I'd have been let off, or I'd have had a tougher sanction or whatever. So some degree of having a system that stands the test of time is really important, and you can only do that on a cross-party basis.
Speaking of which, what happens to the cases which you're currently considering at the moment if there's going to be a review of the system?
Well, you continue with the system that you have until such time as there is a new system. We've not got there's not a case before, I'm not meant to say this, but I'm going to. There isn't a case before our committee at the moment. We're not considering a report at the moment, but you never know when something might come out of the woodwork. But we are considering a report on the code of conduct and possible changes to the way it operates.
So you're fulfilling your policy role as a committee, thinking about how the standard systems work,
rather than our adjudicatory role. The only adjudication that we have had on our books, as it were, recently is that of Mr. Paterson.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions we've had in from our audience. Thank you to everyone for sending them in, and please do continue to send them in. And also you can, I believe, upvote the ones you think are most interesting for me to ask to our guests. I've got a question here from Meg Russell, and I think I'll put this one to you, Eric, first, because I know it's something that you've thought a lot about in the past. She says, On other matters, notably the dissolution of Parliament Bill and the abolition of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the government has argued that voters must be the ultimate arbiters of what is right. So why do the government and indeed Owen Paterson wish to avoid arguing this case with the voters in a by-election, if that would be the upshot of a recall petition that he might be subject to if the sanction stood that Chris's committee has recommended?
Sure, I hope you aren't under the misapprehension that I'm here representing the government, because I certainly am not. And of course, the recall petition does preserve the electors making that final decision. But I'm not here to defend the government. I've had no discussions with the government about Mr. Paterson or the whips.
I'm very sorry, I wasn't intending to imply that. I know in your past role, when you were a minister and responsible for standards in local government, that you were of the view at that time that it was the sort of the power of the ballot box was the most important way of upholding standards, ethical standards in local government.
Yeah, yes, it is. I mean, there was quite a lot of game playing in local government that people would be reported in terms of breach of of the ethics regime almost routinely, and the most effective way of dealing with that, which we're only really interested in corruption, was via the police. But I think this is something entirely different. I wouldn't seek to, as a member of the House of Lords, seek to tell the House of Commons what they're supposed to do. But what I do know is that nobody won yesterday. It was a real mess, and we need to come out of this, and we need to try and put politics to one side. And it does sound as though there has been some movement, and I would welcome that. But we're not going to be able to get some movement until the fate of Owen Paterson is decided.
I agree with that. Just one other reform I wonder about. At the moment, standards reports and the motions for them are moved by the government and at a time of the government's choosing. I just wonder whether that shouldn't actually be done by the committee itself, and the committee should be able to decide on the timing. And then it would have made more sense, I think, in a way. This is not me talking about me, but it may sound it, but I just think it would have made more sense if I had moved the motion and moved it first, and then anybody else speak afterwards. But
maybe that's one of the things that could be considered by the whatever process happens now.
Well, I think in the end it will be the Standards Committee that comes up with a new process, because that is the way that the House has always done it. Yep. And I don't think it'll be the John Whittingdale Committee. I don't think that will come to pass.
So I have a question here which you all might have a view on. I'm going to put it to you, Shirley, in the first instance. Jeff Gleisner has asked, is not now the time, as in, is it now the time, to abandon the idea of self-regulation by Parliament of its own standards? And I think, obviously, the background to this, parliamentary privilege, there's always been a sense that the House of Commons should have exclusive cognizance over its own affairs. Is that still justified? Or, as in so many other things, on MPs' expenses, on their salaries and pensions, on bullying and harassment and so on, self-regulation is really has been pared away. Should the same happen for the MP's code of conduct? And that's to you, Shirley, sorry.
Yeah, in self-regulation, there's been a move away from self-regulation in so many sectors because of the problems of it looking to the outside world, or indeed being the real case that people are marking their own homework. And the thrust of our CSPL report is about gaining independence for regulatory bodies and getting stronger rules. We actually heard relatively little about, or very little about the Code of Conduct for MPs in our listening, and about the events of the last 2 days. We did ask for concerns to come about anything in government, but we got a lot of noise about the 4 areas that we've made our big recommendations. We didn't get concerns about this. I suspect that the move away from self-regulation is inevitable, and sits with the need to be able to demonstrate that you've got a strong regulatory system in place, and that's what the public need to see and develop trust in our systems. So yes, I think it's probably inevitable.
Chris, would you like to?
Well, the question is, what does non-self-regulation of parliamentary code of conduct mean? Does it mean that the rules on stationery, for instance, should be adjudicated in a court of law with lawyers and legal representation? For instance, should paid lobbying be a criminal offence, which is judged in a court of law, and in which case I guess Owen Paterson wouldn't be subject to a recall, he'd be going to prison.
We have another question that asks exactly this.
Well,
should
indeed.
It all be put
So,
on legislative footing? I mean, the complaints that we heard yesterday about the lack of an option for appeal and so on, the need to be able to involve lawyers in the process, which I understand they actually were to an extent already in the process, but all that does point towards the idea of maybe it should just be statutory. And
what historically we've always done is both houses, there isn't parliament, there's two houses, incidentally, is that they've always exercised the right to finally adjudicate. Interestingly, in relation to the independent expert panel, which finds on cases of sexual harassment and bullying, of course, the only decision that the House or MPs can make is yay, nay, at the final vote. And that's partly because of my amendment, which said there should be no debate or opportunity for amendment at that point. Now, I guess it's possible we could end up with that. But I heard lots of MPs yesterday say they want less independence in the system. And I think that's what Jacob Rees-Mogg was saying again today. And if that's the case, there's going to be a battle.
It would certainly be the opposite to the trajectory we've seen on other things, as Shirley was saying. Shirley, you look like you wanted to come in there.
I was just going to say that I don't think legislation is the answer to everything. Indeed, it would be unfortunate if it was. And I'm reminded of Nolan's original 3 principles for the delivery of ethical standards. He talked about 3 things: education, scrutiny, and independent regulation. And what we're doing right now is focusing an awful lot on the independent regulation discussion, but we mustn't lose sight of the education, which is so important.
Eric, did you want to come in on this question about whether we should put the system on a more legislative basis?
I think a legislative basis sometimes can be illusory, because ultimately Parliament has a right to change legislation and is ultimately supreme. What is important is having a set of regulation that is open and transparent. And we need to take some of the mystery out of it. I certainly sometimes find, when you're talking to senior civil servants or former ministers who are kind of wanting to take up posts, and many of them are looking at the regulations in very minute detail. But if you're looking for a sort of loophole to avoid the ministerial code, you haven't entirely understood the functions of the ministerial code. And I think there is a very strong case for tearing the ministerial code in half, almost literally, and putting the Nolan principles of public life up there and central in terms of that's our ethics code, and revert the rest to guidelines. And I think there has been a neglect, particularly of I think it's the last of the principles, which is of leadership, and people in authority, ministers, members of parliament, have a duty to set an appropriate tone and to uphold those principles of public life.
I guess the question and this is obviously for ethical standards regulators, the age-old question, rules versus principles. If you were to move to that sort of system, and this is again to you, Eric, the question then would be, who is the final adjudicator on whether a principle has been broken, and is that an independent process? You know, you could easily say to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, you know, that she has to adjudicate on the code, but is it her adjudicating, or is it, who is the sort of figure you're appealing to? And I think a lot of people would argue that some of the problem with the ministerial code at the moment is the fact that in the end, you know, for good constitutional reasons, the Prime Minister is the final sort of arbiter of whether it has been broken or not, but he doesn't necessarily have to, you know, to take account of the independent processes which are intended to sort of inform that judgment.
But he has to bear the consequences of not taking an action. He has to bear the consequences of taking action. And I think, I mean, if you've got power, then responsibility comes with that, and with responsibility comes accountability. I mean, one of the reasons why I think a number of reforms, particularly on ACOBA, have not taken place, is because there's been a kind of a power grab to try and take powers away from the Prime Minister. I've never been concerned about that. My concern really is that that somebody does take a decision, that somebody does look at taking action, and if they don't take action, then they're accountable. Now, we've regularised that since the beginning of this year. We've formally written to the Cabinet Office explaining where people have breached the rules. I mean, it's up to them to make the decision, but I've often felt that ACOBA has been a convenient fig leaf to governments of all political persuasions to pretend that things are happening when they're not.
Just to build on this question of, you know, what is fundamentally, you know, at stake here, there's a really interesting question from Mike Aronson that's come in, and he says, isn't the and I'm going to put this question first to Chris, isn't the fundamental issue what Honora O'Neill characterised as trustworthiness before trust? No amount of regulation can deliver ethical behaviour on the part of people who are not trustworthy. The onus is on people in public positions to demonstrate that trustworthiness. I'm just interested in your view, from the point of view of MPs, how you think they can go about demonstrating they are worthy of trust. Eric's talked about, you know, being held accountable for adhering to a set of principles. How can MPs, for example, as a set of people within our sort of public system, go about that?
Well, I mean, if you just take the word selflessness, which is one of the Nolan principles, which obviously I support, what does it mean? Does that mean I should say I don't want to be paid as an MP? I should have no expenses. I should travel at my own expense every day to Parliament from South Wales. I don't think most people think that it does mean that. But selflessness, I mean, I think it's RuPaul said, if you can't love yourself, how can you love anyone else? Which is fairly close, actually, to what Jesus said, but in a slightly different way. So I kind of, the problem about principles which are really important is they're very difficult to make justiciable. How could the Commissioner decide whether I had been selfless or not? It would be an entirely subjective judgment that she would be coming to. Rules are therefore really important, and making them as clear as possible is important. One of my problems with the way that the ministerial code operates is that it is completely lacking in transparency. I mean, the register of ministerial interests most of the time isn't even an accurate list of the ministers because people have resigned or whatever. So it ought to be updated, as ours is in the Commons, every fortnight and published every fortnight. And every single finding from the advisor on ministerial conduct should be published in full. And then the public can decide whether the Prime Minister has made a fair judgment on the basis of the advice that has been made and take the hit or not take the hit. That, I think, would be a better constitutional settlement. As things stand, the danger for the Prime Minister always, any Prime Minister, is, power corrupts. And you kind of want to protect your friends, and every new day enters you take an extra step down the same road, and then you find actually you're so far away from the Nolan principles that trust has eroded. And for me, as a lover of Parliament, sorry, that sounds really weird, but I mean, as somebody, I've written a lot about Parliament in history. I care about Parliament. I believe that it's the best way of changing the world. If Parliament falls into disrepute, nobody can change the world for good.
Shirley, can I put this trustworthiness point to you? Because I'm interested in your reflection on other professions which do seem to manage to sort of sustain trust in a way that politicians and the sort of political class don't manage to. It's a sort of holy grail, isn't it? But how do you think, why do you think that is the case? How are those people doing that in a way that's just not possible? Doesn't seem to be possible. Perhaps it is possible. Perhaps people are making the wrong decisions.
I really hope it is possible because, like Chris, I absolutely care about the democratic process and think Parliament must command respect and continue to command respect. The point about standards, you can't legislate against or legislate against the standards is really right. And what each sector has done is to turn those standards into rules or codes of conduct that are relevant for their setting. And so that's why they're different. The key thing, I think, for most of the professions is that they have independent professional regulators, and there's a relationship between the individual professional and that professional body. And that professional body is quite separate from the employer, where it works most effectively. So you can lose your job because you don't deliver the standards, whatever your employer is saying about you. We've got such a different situation in Parliament, and over the years we've developed all these different kinds of components of the system, which is really complex and hard to understand. We did hear people saying that we need to create a single ethical watchdog overseer, single regulator that brings it all together and simplifies it. That's a very attractive idea. It's very difficult to do in practice. And so where we were in our recommendations is about saying, how do we make each part of this work better? But I think that the principle of independence and not being able to turn it over when you don't like the answer, that's got to be integrated into each part of the regulatory framework in politics. And until that happens, I think it's very difficult to get the trustworthiness that you want unless conventions are all being followed in a trustworthy way. But we've heard that that isn't working well now. And as the Boardman review is recommending, we would agree, the time of convention has come to an end and we need more compliance with clearer rules.
Eric, can I put this to you? Would you agree with Dame Shelly that it's about independence and it's about not being able to just change the system willy-nilly so that people don't know what the system is to which anyone is being held?
I mean, you could get quite a bit of compliance within the system by doing other things. It would be quite possible, I think it is an arguable case so far as civil servants are concerned, that you could make it a breach of contract if they engaged in lobbying or if they fail to take the necessary advice. It would be possible to put members of parliament, ministers could sign up to a code whereby if they were in breach, they would lose financially because of that process. And I agree wholeheartedly that it would be a mistake to have an overall ethics organisation that did everything. I think there is some strength in the separate nature and looking very carefully at the particular risks that exist. But I think we need to be a little bit more flexible in terms of the way in which we approach things. And I've been very worried about lobbying for a long time, and I think I particularly welcome the idea of ensuring that ministers and top civil servants should not be allowed to join lobbying firms, that there should be a decent gap of 5 years. I think there is a case for moving on to, even more onto an exception regime. That if somebody is wanting to go into an area where they had responsibility, this responsibility must be on them to persuade others that it's a legitimate thing to do. And I think it's those kind of, it's in a way, we need not to have just one kind of shot in our locker. We've got to be able to triangulate the problem through a combination of regulation, employment contracts, and a code of conduct.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting what CSPL were proposing on that front in terms of more robust ways in which ACOBA might be able to follow up on breaches of its recommendations. I'm going to turn now to a question we've had in from Una Gay, and I'm going to put this to Chris to start with. And she asks, should there, and I think she's thinking about what happened yesterday and some of the factors that might have led to the sort of the problem that we saw. Should there be an income cap on MPs' outside earnings? She says, I appreciate arguments about keeping in touch with the outside world through employment, but voters find the scale, and this is something you were saying, voters find the scale of outside interests completely incomprehensible for an MP supposedly working full time. She suggests an annual cap of £50,000. What do you think about that proposal?
Well, the thing is, I mean, I have some earnings from writing my books. I have to say none of them has ever earned me that much. But I think the difficulty is it's perfectly legitimate for people, for instance, to work as a GP or as a lawyer. A barrister might be earning considerably more than that. I don't think that the amount of money is the nub of the issue. I think in this particular case, when Owen is still earning more than £9,000 a month, voters do start to think, well, hang on, what's your main job? Is your main job working for Randox, or is your main job working for your constituents? As things stand, I'm not in favour of a cap, but I can see why lots of people will be attracted to it. But in the end, you have to be able to justify to your constituents. And one of the problems is that the sword of justice does not wave equally in different constituencies. If you're in a northern, I'm just note that Ian Paisley was found guilty of something very similar to Owen Paterson and suspended for 30 days. There was no recall petition in his constituency. Chris Davis was found guilty of a lesser offence, but nonetheless, recall petition, and of course he lost the by-election. So the safety of your seat, the historic safety of your seat, is a material issue, and there's not much fairness in all of that.
Dame Shirley, I know that CSPL has looked at this issue of outside interests of MPs. Do you see that being a factor in the problems we then see with this question of paid advocacy?
We have looked at it, and we haven't made any clear recommendations other than it would be unwise to stop people being able to continue with their outside professional accreditation. And I don't know what the committee would say about a cap, because we haven't specifically discussed that in recent years, but I think we would identify many of the same problems as Chris has just outlined.
Sorry, and incidentally, there's one other problem, which is we deal with earned income, we don't deal with unearned income.
Yes.
So
exactly.
Arguably, there's a very different thing there.
Eric, did you want to...
I mean, that's exactly right. If we want to get a house full of incredibly rich people living off investment income, or people of vast estates, this would be a way to do it. I think ultimately it's got to be a question for the electorate to decide. When we look at people that come to us in terms of advice, we're only looking at the government's interest. We're not looking at how much they earn. That's something they have to justify to their electors, and the system needs to be transparent. You can't have one rule for civil servants where they can go away and get enormous sums of money, and not for members of parliament. But those members of parliament are responsible and accountable to their electorates, and I know a number of them are quite sensitive to the sums of money that they are earning.
Can I just pick up and support that point about transparency? And that's something that we've argued for in this report. And at the moment, there is, as Eric was saying earlier on, really quite a lack of transparency across the departments about earnings. We can't solve the huge variations in income and geographical financial positions, but we can ensure that the public are aware of what people are earning and how they're getting that money.
That's a really interesting point, and we've actually had a question in on this very transparency point, which I guess perhaps I'll put to you to begin with, Eric, not as a spokesman for the government, but just because I haven't put a question first to you for a while. Hannah Berry says, transparency will be essential for the government to rebuild trust with the public, and she's interested to hear the panel's views on how government could become more transparent. Transparency, she says, will surely encourage those who are perhaps skating the line to act more ethically. Is that something you agree with?
Yeah, well, I did put a suggestion to the committee that members of Parliament, ex-ministers, should sign the register of lobbyists, even if they're doing things in-house. But what could the government do? They could do a number of things. I think there is a reasonable point with regard to who is seeing who or not producing things on a quarterly basis. I agree with the report that maybe a monthly basis is something that could be happened sooner if possible. We need to know who is seeing who and to a degree what they're saying. I think there is a strong case for saying that ministers and senior civil servants should not engage in lobbying government. I think there is a strong case for ensuring that when people are agreeing to the various conditions put down in terms of confidentiality, etc., that there is a form of even light touch monitoring to ensure that is the case. But ultimately, there has to be consequences. And I mean, this time last year, I was in a terrific kind of scuffle with officials who were reluctant to the idea that ACOBA, what was happening in ACOBA, the people in terms of the honours list should be consulted. Now we've kind of moved on with regard to government appointments and the House of Lords. But that really isn't enough. We need to the government needs to get through the threshold of credibility, and people, I think, need to see that there are consequences for people who don't obey the rules. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should try and criminalise it, but we certainly should look in terms of being able to recap sums of money if people are not prepared to abide by the rules.
I think we've just got time for a very quick answer on this transparency point. Shall I come to you next, Shirley, and then Chris, and then I'm very sorry that we'll have to wrap up.
Yes, I mean, just to support what I was saying, in our report, we've made a number of recommendations about transparency, and particularly around lobbying. We've made recommendations about the accessibility and timing of data about lobbying, and that we've also suggested that the Cabinet Office should collate departmental information about lobbying, which is very, very variable, and that should be published monthly, not quarterly, on a centrally managed and accessible database.
Thank you. Chris,
and I think I think it should be I completely support that recommendation, and I think that it should be coordinated with the parliamentary one, so that any member of the public who wants to know what, I don't know, I'm going to land on Michael Gove just because I am, what Michael Gove has received and has been up to and so on, it should all be in one place, not in two different places. At the moment, it's almost impossible to find out the ministerial register of interests and meetings and all the rest of it. It's all, I think it's done deliberately like that to be as untransparent as possible. I just want to end with one thing about lobbying. I'm a passionate supporter of lobbying. When I was on the mental health bill, it was so, I'm not a mental health expert, it was so important to me that people came in from the pharmaceutical companies, from the charity, mental health charities, from the the BMA and so on, to inform me so that I could draft the amendment, which is now the law. And I could do it on the basis of knowledge. There was nothing untoward about it. It was perfectly, and the pharmaceutical companies were just as welcome as the mental health charities. But you just need to be able to know where you, the individual MP, have a commercial interest. And that's where I'm afraid we're in a bit of a quagmire at the moment.
Thank you. Well, can I say a big thank you to my panel for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you to you at home for joining us for what I hope has been as fascinating a discussion for you as for me. This is the second of our 4 events which we're holding today. This afternoon we'll be joined by Standards Commissioners from Ottawa and from Belfast, as well as Duncan Hames from Transparency International, to talk about what the UK government can learn from its counterparts around the world and in the devolved administrations. And then the conference will close with reflections from Peter Riddle, until recently Public Appointments Commissioner, on how the public appointments process, something we didn't have time to touch on today, can be improved. Please do join as many of these events as you can. All the information is on our website, and they will all be, recordings of the events will all be online as soon as possible as we can, within 24 hours after the event. Thanks very much, everyone.